I'm Algenon Cash, and you're locked in. Welcome back. Today we've got a special guest, Mitch Kokai, senior political analyst at the John Locke Foundation, and someone who's covered the North Carolina General Assembly longer than most of us have been following politics. With the 2025 session underway, Republicans leading both chambers, a Democratic governor in Josh Stein, and major bills on immigration, state auditor power, budget, and a whole lot more. Mitch's insights are essential. We'll examine what's moved, what's poised for debate, and how it all affects you. Mitch, great to have you on the show, man. Thank you for locking in. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Algenon. I thought for a moment you were going to say I was covering this stuff longer than most people have been alive, and I would have thought, well, if your audience is young people, maybe, but for most of us, that would not be true. But yes, I've been paying at least some attention to this stuff for more than 20 years.
That is incredible, and I sleep better at night knowing that you have your eyes on the North Carolina General Assembly and letting us know what's going on. Let's just start there. I mean, they're in the middle of the long session. I think they're starting to wind to an end here. Maybe they'll adjourn in July or August. But how would you describe this long session? What's the overarching theme?
Well, I would say right now you still give them an incomplete because the main thing that is on the agenda in every long session is to write a new budget. And so the good news is we got the budget proposed fairly early on from Governor Josh Stein. The state Senate approved a budget plan fairly early in the process. The state House has now approved a budget plan relatively early in the process. We're well before the start of well, not well before, but we're still before the start of the new fiscal year on July 1st. But it doesn't look as if there's going to be an agreement between the two chambers in time for the new budget to take effect on July 1st. And part of that is because while the House and Senate have agreed on how much overall general fund spending they want in the budget year that starts July 1st and in the second year that starts in July 1st of 2026. Well, they've agreed on that, which is important. They've decided how much money is going to be spent. They do have some very different ideas about how to spend that money, and it's not entirely clear that they're really in much of a rush to come to some agreement. There's been some discussion of the idea that if they don't reach an agreement by the end of June, they might just take some time off and come back either late summer or early fall to try to get it resolved. And so that I think would tend to signal to you that it's been somewhat incomplete. Also, for people who have been following this fairly closely, there's been quite a bit of action at the General Assembly. The State House has been busy. The State Senate has been busy. They haven't done a whole lot in terms of finalizing each other's bills. Just before we chatted, I went back on the legislature's website to confirm this. But as of this point, during the 2025 legislative session, which has now been going on for close to half a year, Governor Josh Stein has signed two bills. He hasn't vetoed anything yet, but he signed two bills, and that means that not many bills are getting through both chambers of the General Assembly and to the governor. And I think that's something that, at least at this stage in the game, is a little unusual. You might not see a ton of bills reach the governor by the middle of June or close to the middle of June, but probably more than two normally by this point. And that signals to me that the House and Senate have their priorities, and they've not yet come to an agreement that, okay, these are things that we're going to try to push in the other chamber and we'll make some compromises. You accept the bill that we like, and we accept the bill that you like, and get some of this stuff done.
You know, Mitch, you talk about the difference between the House and the Senate in terms of reconciling the budget. What are some of the policies that they're disagreeing on? I mean, what are some of the specifics that they can't seem to reconcile?
The biggest thing and we're talking about within the budget because there are also some other legislative priorities where they've passed different versions of a bill and they've not yet reached agreement on that. But within the budget, which is the key thing, probably the biggest difference is taxes and what they want to do on taxes. The state Senate is very aggressive in its plan on continuing the personal income tax rate cuts, We know that the state law already calls for the corporate income tax rate to go away. It's scaled out. Nothing needs to be done to change that from happening. Of course, Governor Stein called for a pause to that to keep the current uh, corporate income tax rate where it is, but neither the House nor the Senate's going along with that, and they're allowing that the current law to go forward with the corporate income tax rate going to zero. But when it comes to personal income tax rates, there's already a plan within the law to cut the rate down to 3.99%, just under 4%. But the House and Senate have different ideas about where to go from there. The Senate looked at a couple of other uh, planned income tax rate cuts that had revenue triggers and said, let's get rid of the revenue triggers and go ahead and have these tax rate cuts take effect. And then they added in even more tax rate cuts beyond what was already in the law. On the other side, the House basically kind of wants to put a pause on where things are going with tax rate cuts. Two additional tax rate cuts that would have revenue triggers. The House put in higher revenue triggers, and from the Senate's perspective, high enough that they actually wouldn't take effect. And in fact, that's been a bone of contention. As soon as the House came out with its plan, the Senate was accusing the House of wanting tax increases because of these changes to the revenue triggers. So while the House doesn't is a little bit less inclined to go forward with the rate cuts in the future, they would do a couple different things with taxes. One, the House would return the sales tax holiday that we used to have near the end of the summer for parents buying their kids' school supplies. That would come back. And the House also wants to do some different things in terms of uh, having tips, most tips be exempt from taxes, which is something that we heard about, of course, for President Trump on the federal level. The House would also raise the standard deduction, which is something for folks, good for folks who are at the bottom end of the income scale, because that takes more income out of the tax man's purview in the first place. That's something that has been part of previous tax reforms that North Carolina has done. As they've lowered the rate, they've also raised the standard deduction, which incidentally makes the tax code more progressive, even though we have a flat tax rate. So that's the big thing. But just more quickly on some of the other things, they do different things on this NC Innovation Project, which is something that the General Assembly decided to give $500 million to this nonprofit group, which promotes university research and tries to turn it into profitable business products. Both the House and the Senate would take that money back. The House would take all $500 million back and give it to hurricane recovery. The Senate, on the other hand, would take $400 million back, take the $400 million and give it to this new joint UNC Duke Children's Hospital. And then the other $100 million, the Senate would give back to NC Innovation, but in $25 million increments over 4 years. So that's a difference. I mentioned the Children's Hospital. The Senate wants to pump up the money going toward that hospital, while the House wants to scale it back. There already have been some money devoted to this project, and the House wants to scale that back. Employee pay raises, a big difference. The Senate wants smaller raises. The House wants larger raises, larger even for teachers than what Governor Stein had proposed. The House wants 2.5% raises for general state employees and an average 8.7% raise for teachers. And they also want to boost the pay for starting teachers so that if you incorporate the salary supplements that most school districts give, that by the end of this process, the average starting salary for a starting teacher in North Carolina would be more than $56,000, which would be a substantial jump. And a couple other things that I should mention. One is the certificate of need, which is a permission slip that the government provides for healthcare providers if they want to expand a hospital or add hospital beds or add a major piece of medical equipment. The Senate would get rid of the con law entirely. The House does not address that in its budget. And I should also mention, since this could come into play depending on whether Governor Stein accepts this budget accepts the final budget or not, is that both plans have had some degree of bipartisan support. In the Senate side, there were a handful of Democrats who went along with the Republicans. I believe it was four who voted for their budget. On the House side, many more Democrats. While it was still split, 20 Democrats voted against the budget. The majority of the caucus, 27, voted for of the Democratic caucus voted for the House budget the first time around. So it'll be very interesting to see once a final deal comes together, if a final deal comes together, whether Democrats will continue to go along with this or whether the final plan will split the General Assembly completely along party lines. And if that happens, then a potential veto from Governor Josh Stein could get very interesting because while the Senate Republicans have a veto-proof supermajority, the House, the Republicans do not. They are one vote short of a supermajority and would need at least one vote from a Democrat to override a gubernatorial veto.
Thank you for that rundown, Mitch. That was very good. And you mentioned a couple of things that stand out to me. Definitely, I've been hearing the debate around teacher pay and how we could end up becoming one of the most competitive states in the Southeast in terms of compensation for our teachers, which I always think it's really important to make sure that we take good care of our teachers. You know, what also stands out to me is that it feels like some of the things that we are hearing at a national and federal level is starting to influence policy at a state level, which I think is fascinating. You mentioned the removing the tax on tips, which mirrors the debate that we're having right now in Congress. I'd heard some talk about creating a state level Doge agency that would go and find fraud, waste, and abuse. Um, we've obviously seen the impact of some of the tariffs here in the state of North Carolina. So it's really interesting to me. I'd love to get your comments on how some of the federal policy and the debates that are happening inside the Beltway are now really starting to influence what we do here in North Carolina.
Yes, you're certainly right about that. And that has always happened, that what's happening in DC affects what's happening in Raleigh, and to some extent vice versa. What's happening in the states will affect what happens in DC. But you are seeing quite a bit of attention being paid in Raleigh this time based on what's going on in DC, and specifically Republican legislative leaders looking at what the Trump administration is doing and echoing it in some respects. You mentioned Doge. This is another area where the House and Senate take a different approach to it. In the House, the new Speaker, Destin Hall, set up what he called it basically a state level Doge, where a committee is looking into some of the same things that the federal Doge, Department of Government Efficiency, is looking into, while on the other side, the Senate, rather than setting up a committee on this, basically wanted to hand the Doge-like ideas or the Doge-like review process to the state auditor. They passed something called the DAVE Act. And it's an acronym, but basically it's linked to the fact that our new auditor is named Dave Bolick, and he has would get some new authorities in this DAVE Act to be able to do some of the Doge type things that have been happening in DC. I think another area where you're seeing quite a bit of influence in North Carolina, based on what's being talked about in DC, and certainly one of the big pieces of news that's happening around the country over the past couple of days with the protests, is a very strong focus on immigration and immigration enforcement. There are a couple of different bills that have been going back and forth between the House and Senate that would step up the requirements for law enforcement officials to cooperate with federal officials on immigration. And both of those are kind of moving their way through the General Assembly. They're not finalized, but these are bills that could get relatively soon to Governor Josh Stein and might end up being the first things that he would consider using his veto stamp on. So we'll see what happens with that. Also on that immigration front, one of the things that's being discussed in one of these bills would be allowing a resident of a city to file a civil suit if their government officials are enacting so-called sanctuary policies, sanctuary city or sanctuary county policies, where they don't want to comply with the federal rules on immigration. And so it'll be very interesting to see whether that goes forward, and if it ends up getting to Governor Stein's desk, and if he ends up vetoing it, will Republicans in the General Assembly be able to round up any Democratic votes to get them to have this bill over the finish line, or is it just an idea that dies on the vine and ends up being part of next year's election campaigns?
The state Republicans, I mean, do they run sort of a political risk here, Mitch, of aligning their policy agenda so tightly with the president's? I mean, everything you've said there seems to correlate almost perfectly to what MAGA Republicans are doing in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I think there is a risk of that. It's entirely possible that Republicans in the General Assembly could follow an agenda that has very little to do with what Donald Trump and the Trump administration are talking about in Washington, D.C. And I think there are a number of bills that have been discussed and passed through both chambers that really don't have anything to do with what Trump or MAGA Republicans are talking about. But there are some bills that do align with what the Trump administration is talking about. And I think on the House side, having a specifically named DOJ committee aligns with that. And also, if you remember from when Governor Josh Stein gave his State of the State address, the official response was from the House Speaker, Destin Hall. And I think Destin Hall, in some respects, went out of his way to talk about some of the things that the Trump administration was talking about, using some of that same language. So there is a possibility that you run a risk that by aligning yourself so closely with Donald Trump, that if what Trump does ends up turning against Republicans, especially in a midterm coming up, that could cost the Republicans in the General Assembly some seats. And I don't know of anyone outside of maybe the Democratic Party establishment who thinks that there's a danger of Republicans losing control of either chamber of the General Assembly in the next election. But it's certainly possible that if people turn against them, that they could lose some seats and certainly have a much closer division between Republicans and Democrats than they do now. As we mentioned a little bit earlier, the Senate has a veto-proof supermajority of 30 Republicans to 20 Democrats. On the House side, they're one seat short of a supermajority, but it's still a comfortable margin, 69 Republicans to 51 Democrats. And so there is a danger that they could lose seats. And if they really make people mad at what Republicans are doing, probably not in the next cycle, but maybe in a couple of cycles, it could be a possibility of Democrats taking control again. They controlled the General Assembly for the most part, for a century or more, and really lost power in 2010. The Republicans have been in charge now for 15 years, going on the 16 by the time that people will go into the voting booths again. And the pendulum always swings at some point. So Republicans need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, because I think the jury is still out on whether or not, all these various policies that are being pushed in Washington, D.C., whether it's tariffs, the ICE raids and the crackdown on immigration, even DOJ. I think the jury is still out on whether or not the public is receiving these things in a positive way. We see what's happening right now out at LA, and the reaction that we're having from the public out there now, which I have the feeling that we're going to start seeing more of these kind of reactions in large cities across the country. North Carolina is not a deeply red state. I mean, it's a purple state, and I do think Republicans should be aware that public sentiment could change and shift pretty dramatically on all this. And not only could it in fact impact Republican majorities in the General Assembly, but also it could impact federal election cycles here in North Carolina as well. The president didn't win North Carolina by some great margin. I mean, obviously he carried the state, but the pendulum certainly could swing back in the other direction. what are you hearing right now about Medicaid expansion? I know that in this budget that's being debated in Congress, that could adversely impact the Medicaid expansion program that we've done here in North Carolina. Are you hearing about hearing that the General Assembly may roll back that expansion, or what's the debate there?
Couple of important points on this. First of all, when North Carolina expanded Medicaid, it was under the condition that the Congress was going to fund 90% of the bill for the expansion population, which is substantially more than what the federal government pays for the traditional Medicaid population. So the traditional Medicaid population, the feds cover about two-thirds, around 65%. And one of the carrots to get states to sign on to Medicaid expansion was that the feds would cover 90%. Now, of course, for years and years, our legislative leaders did not want Medicaid expansion. And one of the concerns at the time was that 90% match is not going to last forever. At some point, the federal government is going to decide to either cut back the expansion population payout to the 65% that it covers for everyone else, or that the percentages would meet somewhere in the middle. Maybe they would raise the percentage that the federal government would cover for the existing Medicaid population, the traditional Medicaid population, and then lower it for the expansion population. But for years that was discussed and nothing happened. And you might remember that when Phil Berger, the leader of the Senate, finally came on board with Medicaid expansion, one of the things that he said was, we've been watching DC. They've had Democratic president, Democratic Congress, Republican president, Republican Congress, Democratic president, Republican Congress, Republican president, Democratic Congress. None of them have done anything about changing this Medicaid badge. And so it looks pretty certain that they aren't going to do anything about it. So when Medicaid expansion was passed, one of the pieces of the bill that became law was that if the federal government ever steps back from that 90% match, expansion goes away. So the law, as it stands now, if Congress changes the match and cuts back that 90% to something lower, our state law says Medicaid expansion goes away. Now, does anyone really expect it's going to go away? I don't know that many people do. I think what would happen is that the General Assembly would come back and find out what it could do to help cover the difference between what they've expected the federal government to pay and what the state's now going to have to cover. Something would happen on that front. But I can tell you that as part of the current budget debate, nothing has really happened on that front. I mean, either the House or the Senate or both could have said, we could be socked with a huge bill on Medicaid expansion, and so we ought to set some money aside for that. Neither one of them has done it. And when asked about that, some have said, and I think I'm attributing this correctly to Senator Phil Berger, and if not, someone in the comments or someone could contact me or contact you and correct it. But I think he said they talk about a lot of things in DC and not a lot of them actually happen. So until something happens on that, the General Assembly is not going to deal with it. But that is a big question mark that's out there that could affect the state budget fairly substantially. And nothing is really sitting aside at this point to deal with that if the state has to cover so much more money to keep expansion in place.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. I recall when my good friend Senator Krovic was leading the Health and Human Services Committee, and all this was being debated. This is what her fear was, and she talked extensively about it, that she just had a feeling that at some point there would be some change at the federal level and some administration that would negatively impact North Carolina and our state budget. And now we've had so many families and individuals that have gotten onto the Medicaid rolls, and it could really have an adverse impact on them if the program gets scaled back. And so we're just in a really interesting conundrum here. Mitch, you're a free market thinker. Obviously, you're a policy analyst for the John Locke Foundation, which is also the organization that produces the Carolina Journal. I write op-eds for the Carolina Journal. I really enjoy being able to use that as a vehicle to share my thoughts and commentary. And I have been writing extensively about tariffs since last year, when candidate Trump started to raise this idea. I started to respond and react to it. I've seen some pieces that you've written recently that comes out against tariffs, and then also President and CEO of the John Locke Foundation, Donald Bryson, has had some very strong opinion pieces about tariffs. What are you generally hearing around the state? Are you in conversation with any of our family farms in eastern North Carolina? Have you seen any kind of impact to our port system related to this tariff policy? Or do you just feel like maybe it's still too early to tell what the impact might be?
Personally, I've not been talking to people about the tariff issue, but I know that we have had some reporters at Carolina Journal and some others who are involved in the research side at the John Locke Foundation talking to people who would be affected by tariffs. And I think that the main thing, and this is something that no business ever likes to have to deal with at any point on any issue, is a great deal of uncertainty. A lot of businesses have to plan well in advance for what they're going to do in terms of ordering supplies, trying to figure out what's going to be my product that I have out there. I'm going to have a range of products, and if so, what do I need in terms of raw materials? And if you don't know whether the raw materials or the inputs that you have for your product are going to cost X or two times X or X plus 30%, it really makes it hard to plan. And so any business that really depends on having some sort of input that comes from another country has a great deal of uncertainty. And this also has an impact, as you alluded to, on not just importers or people who uh, assemble products based on imported inputs, but also exporters, people who are in the agriculture community who kind of knew before the Trump administration, well, this is what we're dealing with tariffs wise from foreign countries and how that affects our output and our ability to export. It's not just the United States considering tariffs. Once we talk about tariffs, anyone else who we're thinking of putting a tariff on is thinking about how they're going to respond and whether they put tariffs on our goods. And so there's just a great deal of uncertainty. And the uncertainty is elevated by the fact that it isn't just the case of the Trump administration saying, okay, we're going to have these tariffs and that's it. It is the case of the Trump administration saying, we're going to have these tariffs, and then shortly afterwards saying, oh, no, we're delaying it, and we'll revisit this in a matter of months. I have contended ever since knowing anything about economics and the way businesses operate, and I'm no PhD expert on this, but I have read enough about it to have had at least some confidence on this statement that businesses are going to be able to thrive pretty well in a system that has strong rule of law and generally open markets and all of the things that we have enjoyed for years and years in the United States. Even if you have some bad tax policies or regulatory policies, if you put that policy in place and it's fairly well baked into the cake, and the businesses can understand what that policy is and can adjust to it, they'll still be able to thrive. They won't be able to thrive as much as if it's a completely free market and the regulatory burden is as low as possible and the tax burden is as low as possible. But if you've got not so great taxes, not so great regulatory burden, some other things that stand in the way of the businesses doing their job, they'll adjust to it and they will thrive not as well as they could with complete freedom, but they'll thrive still because of rule of law and because of the open markets. But if you don't have a consistent policy, that just throws another monkey wrench into it that hurts businesses' ability to plan for the future, including how many people they can hire. I mean, it's not just woe to the business owners, it's woe to employees of businesses who either might not have a job or they might be a prospective employee who can't get a job because that business can't plan to be able to expand in the future and add more employment. So to me, the biggest thing that comes out of all of this discussion about tariffs is that if President Trump had come into office and set a batch of tariffs and said, this is it, this is what we're going to do, no compromise, no change, that would have been a bad choice, but businesses would have incorporated the tariffs into their planning and would have moved forward. Given the fact that the president goes back and forth on tariffs and says one thing one day and says something else the next day, and then we'll revisit the original tariff with an even larger plan than before. That's kind of the worst of both worlds. You're getting tariffs, which are bad, and you're getting uncertainty about tariffs, which makes it worse.
Yeah, the word of the year is definitely uncertainty. And I do think the United States economy structurally is very strong and continues to actually perform. Even our markets continue to perform, but I think that performance is happening in spite of the Trump administration, but has nothing to do or correlates with anything the actual administration is doing. And the general consensus from investors when I'm out here talking to people and raising money and doing what I do day to day is that this is probably one of the greatest self-inflicted economic wounds in modern history. And we are essentially trying to fix something that wasn't quite broken, or at least not broken in the regard that it's been portrayed in the media. So I do hope that the administration gets organized here soon. I don't think as resilient as our economy is, I don't think we can navigate away from a recession if we don't figure out these policies and get some certainty back into the market and do it soon. Mitch, thank you for joining me. Always appreciate you. Always want to encourage my audience. If you are not a subscriber to the Carolina Journal, you definitely need to. Some really great insights. Folks like Mitch and so many others share commentary within the Carolina Journal. They cover statewide a lot of the policies that we just talked about today on the show. They write about it extensively in the Carolina Journal. So make sure you become a subscriber. And again, thank you, Mitch, for this insightful conversation. You've helped us understand not just what's happening, but why it matters and where it's headed. If you want to keep up, follow Mitch's work at the John Locke Foundation and tune back in soon for updates. That's all for today. Stay informed, stay involved, and stay locked in.